Welcome to this explainer. Today, we're taking a massive, sweeping 1400-year history and distilling it down into one structured visual journey. We're going to explore the entire history of Islam. And we aren't just looking at a dry timeline of dates and battles here. We're actually diving into an incredible narrative that's defined by these intense cycles. Cycles of rise, catastrophic fall, and then remarkable resilience. Honestly, understanding these cycles is absolutely crucial if you want to make sense of the geopolitical landscape today. So, our source kicks off this epic story in a lonely cave, high above the bustling trading city of Mecca, way back in the year 610 CE. At the time, the world was totally dominated by two warring superpowers, the Byzantine and Sasanian empires. But up in that cave, a single revelation to a 40-year-old merchant named Muhammad ended up igniting a transformation that was, frankly, far more dramatic than any military conquest of its era.
Okay, let's dive into this narrative by looking at the 5 distinct cycles outlined by our source: origins of a civilization, the Abbasid Golden Age, catastrophe and revival, the gunpowder empires, and finally, colonialism to contemporary crossroads.
Let's jump right into Cycle 1, Origins of a Civilization and the Birth of the Ummah. We'll see how a heavily persecuted local movement somehow built itself into a completely unified state. Those early years were intensely difficult. Following his first revelation, Muhammad faced severe persecution back in Mecca. This all came to a head in 622 CE, with the Hijra, his migration to the oasis city of Medina. Now, you might think of this as a retreat, but it really wasn't. It marked the absolute birth of the Islamic State. It's kind of wild to think about, but within just a single decade, this movement grew so incredibly resilient that by 630 CE, Muhammad actually returned to lead a massive, bloodless conquest of Mecca, destroying the idols in the Kaaba and uniting the tribes. Now, what's really fascinating here is that the source highlights the Constitution of Medina as being, well, perhaps the world's very first written charter of human rights. When Muhammad arrived in Medina, he didn't just preach to the people there. He effectively united these heavily fractured Arab and Jewish tribes who had literally been locked in endless warfare. He created the Ummah, a community bound by mutual obligations, guaranteeing religious freedom for everyone. It completely shifted governments away from old ancestral tribal customs and into a unified, law-based system, a real game changer. Following Muhammad's death in 632 CE, the community naturally faced a massive crisis, but they bounced back incredibly fast. Under early leaders like Abu Bakr and Umar, the empire expanded at lightning speed. They completely unified Arabia through the Ridda Wars, and then pulled off the unthinkable. They decisively defeated both the Byzantine and Sasanian superpowers at the legendary battles of Yarmouk and Qadisiyah. To actually govern these massive new territories, they had to create a pragmatic administrative framework. This included the dhimmi system, which explicitly protected the religious freedoms of Christians and Jews in exchange for a special tax. But, as often happens, that early unity eventually fractured, bringing us to Cycle 2, the Abbasid Golden Age, from Damascus to Baghdad. This represents a massive, macro shift in the Islamic world's focus. The Umayyad dynasty, ruling out of Damascus, was this highly Arab-centric military empire that was just constantly pushing its borders. But then, the Abbasid Revolution in 750 CE completely flipped the script. They moved the capital east and shifted the focus toward inclusive, cosmopolitan intellectualism and scientific synthesis. Under caliphs like Al-Mansur, a brand new capital was built in 762 CE. Designed as a perfect circle right on the banks of the Tigris River, Baghdad became the undisputed center of global knowledge. It housed the famous House of Wisdom, which was this incredible institution that sparked a phenomenal intellectual revolution. The really crucial takeaway here is that Muslim scholars during this golden age didn't just passively preserve ancient Greek and Persian knowledge. They absolutely revolutionized it. Al-Khwarizmi developed algebra. In fact, he gave us the word algorithm, so, you can thank him for your social media feeds. Al-Razi completely revolutionized clinical medicine, and Al-Biruni accurately calculated the Earth's circumference. They built massive hospitals and huge observatories that would go on to influence the entire world for centuries. Yet, empires built on vast wealth inevitably attract external threats, which brings us to Cycle 3, Catastrophe and Revival, defined by the Crusades and the Mongol Storm. The Islamic world was suddenly hit by two massive, devastating shockwaves. First came the Crusades from Europe. Now, the brilliant general Saladin successfully repelled them by recapturing Jerusalem in 1187 CE. But the true catastrophe? That came from the east.
the Mongols, who were just this unstoppable war machine, swept across Asia. In 1258 CE, the Mongols sacked Baghdad. The source vividly describes this event as a complete cultural apocalypse. The House of Wisdom was burned to the ground, and it was said the Tigris River literally ran black with the ink of countless destroyed texts. The classical caliphate, which had stood for 500 years, was annihilated. But, once again demonstrating that incredible resilience, the Egyptian Mamluks finally managed to halt the Mongol advance at the Battle of Ain Jalut in 1260 CE. They effectively saved the rest of the Islamic world from total destruction. Rising from the ashes of that Mongol destruction, the civilization proved its intense adaptability. We enter Cycle 4, the Gunpowder Empires, a triumvirate of power. Armed with brand new gunpowder technologies and massive cannons, these empires totally dominated the early modern world. This era kicks off with Sultan Mehmed II's historic conquest of the impregnable Byzantine capital of Constantinople in 1453 CE, transforming it into Istanbul. Looking at these three giants side by side perfectly synthesizes their very different approaches to power. You've got the Ottomans in the West, who utilized the Devshirme system, recruiting Christian youth into an elite, meritocratic military and government class. In the center, you have the Safavids, who established Shia Islam as the state religion in Persia, which fostered a massive cultural and artistic renaissance. And over in the East, the Mughals, under leaders like Akbar, embraced a really diverse religious tolerance to effectively rule the vast Hindu majority in India. But, like all things, the age of empire eventually fractured. This brings us to our final cycle, Cycle 5, colonialism to contemporary crossroads and the modern challenge. Here, we suddenly see a civilization thrown entirely on the defensive. When Napoleon arrived in Egypt in 1798, it signaled an undeniable shift, a clear demonstration of European technological and military dominance. This sparked a really painful period of European colonization all across the Islamic world, which in turn led to a desperate scramble for internal reform and eventually independence. A massive shock to the system hit in 1924. Following the collapse of the Ottoman Empire after World War I, Mustafa Kemal Ataturk did something unprecedented. He abolished the 1,300-year-old Caliphate entirely. He went on to establish a strictly secular, Western-oriented Turkish republic. Our source highlights this as a major pivotal moment because it raises a really persistent modern question. How does the Islamic world reconcile its deep-rooted traditions with Western secularism and the concept of the modern nation-state? And that directly brings us to the friction we see today. The source outlines several modern phenomena resulting from this tension, and it impartially reports on a whole host of contemporary issues. We see everything from modern structural adaptations, like the rise of a wildly successful trillion-dollar Islamic finance industry, to intense debates over women's roles, the ongoing clash between secular nationalists and religious traditionalists, and of course, highly debated shifting global demographics. In particular, it's really fascinating to see how the source material examines current demographic tensions in Europe. It impartially explores the friction popping up in major European cities regarding the emergence of parallel societies. The core debate here is whether European nations will adapt to these changing demographics or if they're going to struggle with communities that might operate according to their own customs, sometimes outside of traditional European laws and secular values. Looking globally, we are presented with a really stark contrast for the future of this civilization. On one side, there's the incredibly destructive path of radical groups, those who suppress rights, impose harsh religious laws, and utilize terrorism. But on the other side, we see incredibly successful modern integration and moderation. Places like Indonesia, Malaysia, and Turkey prove that Islamic values can absolutely coexist beautifully with democracy, pluralism, and modern development. So as this explainer comes to a close, we are left with the ultimate question posed by our source. How will nearly 2 billion Muslims navigate the temporal and the sacred to write the next chapter of global history? It's been a story of profound resilience, from a quiet desert cave to a highly complex, interconnected world. And the craziest part? The next cycle is being written right now. Thanks so much for joining us.